that may not immediately come to mind when we consider Palestine? Might it be necessary to reconsider what we think of as social as opposed to political questions and think about how the two are actually interrelated? Are there some mediums for addressing the Palestinian struggle that may actually deepen rather than lessen Palestinian oppression? Here today to address these issues are activists from Grassroots Jerusalem, Talat, and alQaws. I'll introduce them in the order of appearance and from there turn it over to the speakers. Fayrouz Sharqawi is the Global Mobilization Coordinator at Grassroots Al-Quds, a platform for Palestinian community mobilization and networking in occupied Jerusalem. They believe that the challenges and responses of Palestinian communities must be articulated and led by them. They research, map, mobilize, and network in order to contribute to the creation and implementation of Palestinian long-term strategies for Jerusalem. Halat Marshud is an activist in Talat, which translates to stepping out, a Palestinian feminist political movement, as well as a researcher in political economy. And last, but by no means least, Izzeddin Mustafa is a Palestinian organizer based in the US and an activist with alQaws, And now, without further ado, we'll turn to Fayrouz for the first segment.
Thank you, Omar. Good evening or good morning, everyone. I have to say that I am really excited to be here speaking next to Hala and Iz, coming from two of my favorite movements in Palestine, Talat and alQaws. And I will be speaking and addressing the problems in international aid systems and how donors and international NGOs can further perpetuate the occupation and colonialism in Palestine rather than help and support the Palestinian struggle for liberation. Maybe speaking a little bit on a global level, even everything I'm going to say about Palestine is true for many other countries around the world. And my first point is going to be about how international aid to Palestinian civil society has, over the years, in fact, depoliticized the Palestinian struggle for liberation and self-determination. And speaking about this, I will actually quote Arundhati Roy, who phrased this effect as the NGOization of resistance, or resistance 9 to 5, which is true for the Indian context as well as for the Palestinian context, and again, many other contexts around the world. In Palestine, aid and aid money flooded Palestine immediately after the signing of the Oslo so-called peace agreement in the mid-90s. The Palestinian civil society up till Oslo, especially during the years that immediately preceded Oslo, Palestinian civil society was an integral part of the Palestinian struggle, an integral part of the Palestinian uprising, the Intifada, the first Intifada that was going on. And the first Intifada, for those who are not familiar with it, is this moment in our history that we wish to see come back. It was an inspiring moment of grassroots mobilization and networking and people uprising against colonialism, occupation, oppression, while coordinating on the grassroots level. Popular committees were spread all over Palestine, coordinating strikes, community organizing, food manufacturing, and many other protests, and many other types of action of resistance. And from this role, when international aid came to Palestine, this role of the Palestinian civil society changed and shifted. And Palestinian civil society and its resistance went back to the office. And our work became from mobilizing and networking and resisting. It started looking more like a daily office routine of writing proposals, reporting on work, and many other problems that I will be addressing. So first of all, it's important to understand at what moment in history this started in Palestine. It's also important to say that when we look at the type of aid and the type of projects that aid money funds in Palestine, we see that in general, donors treat Palestine as a country struck with a natural humanitarian disaster, providing humanitarian aid mostly, turning our issue from a political issue into merely a humanitarian issue, as if we were struck by a tsunami or earthquake, and suddenly most money comes in order to provide humanitarian aid as well as development projects. It's important to realize that this, as much as it might look needed and crucial on a very low micro level, on the macro level, this basically sustains the status quo of colonialism. This merely helps Palestinians survive under the occupation or be occupied in silence. And so, looking at the intervention of donors in Palestine, we see that the donors come with their very typical white Western approach. The white man comes to Palestine and says, I know better than Palestinians what Palestinians need. And I am going to fund this kind of work and this kind of work because this is my agenda and this is what I think should be done in Palestine. We, as the recipients of this money, have no chance in challenging that. And if we want to be funded, then we need to fulfill the eligibility criteria. Now, again, of course, it is not portrayed or framed like that. Usually there are calls for proposals, a donor or a fund calls for proposals from Palestinian civil society, but then there is a whole list of criteria that makes you eligible for this funding. And of course, the most important problem with these criteria is that usually they shift the work from our own agenda as Palestinians, an agenda for liberation, an agenda, an emancipatory agenda, into an agenda of development again and humanitarian aid that does not build up for a vision of liberty and freedom, but rather shackles the organizations into a very narrow spectrum of activism or action. Another important thing to say about aid in Palestine is that because of the way it is managed, the micromanagement of organizations, instead of going out to the street, instead of going out to our communities and working on the ground on building a movement for liberation, what we do as civil society organizations most of the time is spend our time and money and effort and emotions on writing proposals, begging for money, and convincing the donor that we are worthy of that money, and also, of course, worthy more than our fellow Palestinian partners organizations. So the competition is a very important factor here. And then we spend half of the year on writing proposals, or maybe third of the year on writing proposals, and then another third on writing midterm reports, and then the third is spent on writing final reports. And so we spend all of this aid money, basically, or most of it, a very high percentage of it, on the micromanagement system that is forced upon us by donors. Now, again, looking at this from a broader point of view, this also means, again, that donors look down at Palestinians as people who don't have the power, don't have the knowledge in order to decide themselves what to do and how to do it. In addition to that, aid by itself in the Palestinian context is funding the occupation. Funding development, again, development projects under occupation usually means, and providing humanitarian aid under occupation usually means that the aid system takes away responsibility from the occupation state, a responsibility that comes from this occupation, and starts funding the costs of this occupation. This is very similar, by the way, to how the biggest NGO in Palestine works, the Palestinian Authority, which funds, for example, Palestinian, we call them war captives or prisoners in Israeli jails. So instead of pressuring the occupation state into paying the price of this occupation as a tool to pressure to end it, what the aid system does is fund it and take away this responsibility from Israel. And statistics say that 78% of the money that the aid money that arrives to Palestine ends up in the Israeli treasury. It's paid as taxes, it's paid as security fees, and so many different types of fees that need to be paid to the controlling power, the power that controls borders, the power that controls checkpoints. So moving materials in between Palestinian cities is something that you have to pay for to the occupation authorities. Now, speaking of funding the occupation, it's not only funding the occupation, but also looking at aid that is given to the occupation state of Israel. We see that while aid to Palestine is given in the shape of humanitarian aid, capacity building programs, and development programs, we see that aid to Israel is given as cooperation in science, in high tech, in arms trade. And so it could be that the same donor, whether it is a government or a fund, is funding humanitarian aid, limiting and shackling the Palestinian freedom struggle. At the same time, it is empowering the colonizer. It is empowering the state of occupation. So this double standard, this hypocrisy is something that we really need to be aware of when speaking about donors and donor intervention in Palestine. And so this is the context within which international aid is given in Palestine, and its effect on our civil society organizations is severe. Palestinian, again, as I was saying, Palestinian organizations have been in our history an integral part of our popular struggle for freedom and self-determination. So what organizations did before was follow the lead of the community, follow the true needs of the community. The community had the power to decide, and the civil society represented the community. It was part of the community. While today, looking at how civil society organizations in Palestine look like and sound like, we see a huge difference. There is a huge difference between the narrative of the people and the narrative of the organizations. And this is a direct result of the, let's call it, taming that the donor does to civil society organizations. It doesn't only dictate what kind of work you do and dictate agendas, but also change your discourse, change your narrative. And from a discourse of resistance, we are now talking about human rights and human rights under a status quo of colonization. Instead of talking about community organizing and building movements and building visions, fulfilling visions for the future, because we don't only want to break free of the occupation, we also want to translate our own dreams and visions into our people's future. So instead of supporting that, what the aid systems are doing today is shackle us into a very narrow place that is also very alien to our own communities. And so there is also antagonism that is created. Keep in mind also that maybe most of the organizations are established in order to truly serve communities, but then they are corrupted on the way. And this whole culture is built in Palestine and in other countries, again, around the world, where you can also simply look at NGOs and community organizations as a tool for income generation and survival. So it has become a profession also. And again, in order to sustain an organization, we find ourselves having to give up on our principles, having to compromise on ideology, and slowly we simply get mutated. And so it's a very grave picture, looking at organizations drifting away from the people, and while organizations should be the people, are the people, which also means that the people themselves are depoliticized. The people, the Palestinian people in general, are also witnessing and experiencing the effects of this very corrupting system. With the few minutes I have left, I would like actually to talk about what can be done, because I don't want to only focus on what is wrong with this picture. And if you allow me, I would like actually to share a little bit of our story at Grassroots Al-Quds, because just like many other organizations, we established the Grassroots Al-Quds in 2011, and we established it with very traditional aid money, with very traditional, within the very traditional system. Donors dictated what we should be doing in Jerusalem, and we followed their agendas. And after a few years of being stuck in this prison, we decided to break free. We realized that in order to be loyal to our communities, in order to be loyal to the Palestinians in Jerusalem, to be truly serving the need of our own community, we need to break free of the donors. And this is something that we think is true for all civil society organizations who are just like us, still stuck within this system. So we are aware that it is a long process, and we have been doing it for a few years now, and we intend on going on and expanding a model that we have created that gradually is helping us break free of these shackles. So instead of receiving any kind of funding from any kind of donor, we decided that we will be selective about our donors, and that we will not be changing our discourse or adjusting our discourse to any donor agendas. Of course, this came with a huge and very high price to pay. We were broke for some time because it was hard to find donors to actually agree to fund such an organization. So we were also aware that our model should also include other types of funding, and not only donor and foundation donations. So our model, in short, because this might not be very relevant to everyone who is listening, but our model, in short, is a model that is based on, first of all, general support or core funds from donors. Instead of applying for project-based funding where we tailor a project to fit the donor criteria, we apply with our strategic plan. And our strategic plan is the proposal, and based on it, the donor decides whether they would like to support it or not. Again, this does not sustain the organization. And so we added another component, which is crowdfunding, which is a beautiful type of funding. It's not just crowdfunding campaigns online, to be clear. It means support by the people. It means support by our community. It means support by our friends and people who believe in our work. And this is something that we believe should be revived in our communities. I mean, sometimes, of course, taken into consideration that the means are limited, but the community sometimes fails to see how powerful it is in supporting such movements and such organizations. And that's a culture that we think we should certainly encourage. In addition to this, the third component is income generation. And we think that it's important to make our own money in order to be totally free, because income you generate is the true free money, as well as the crowdfunding money. And so far, after 5 years of building this model, we are now 20% free. We make 20% of our annual budget, but our plan is to make this portion grow all the way up to 100. And at the same time, we are also part of conversations with partners, with organizations, with groups that are meeting and discussing ways to counter this very destructive effect of donor intervention in Palestine. And we think that it is important that not only this model, but that other organizations be able to build their own models. I will finish with a comment on a different thing that is happening on the ground in Palestine today, which is also the fact that people are becoming more and more aware of the effect of international aid. on Palestine, and many organizations, not only Grassroots, alQaws, are very aware of the problems in this international aid system. alQaws is one of them. I know Iz might not be addressing that aspect necessarily, but they are aware of these problems as well. But also it's important to see that just like Tal'at, there are movements that are created finally and are aware of these problems, and that are awarely keeping themselves from these dangers and trying to build, even though it is a very hard and challenging way to do it, but community organizing in the true sense of let's do it with the power and resources in the community, and stay away from that colonialism called international aid. It's a very hopeful thing to see that there are so many different initiatives that are happening around Palestine that are translating this into reality.
Hey, thank you so much, Feiruz. Next, we'll turn to Hala.
Thank you so much for organizing this. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you, Feiruz. I'm gonna talk about how we in Tal'at see and perceive liberation in Palestine. I think where Tal'at enters is exactly in bringing feminism to liberation and also politicizing feminism in Palestine. Especially because for years, our emancipation and dignity as women and the daily violence that we encounter have been sidelined or considered as secondary issues in the Palestinian political struggle for liberation, ones to be dealt with after we are liberated from Zionism, and also have been considered a woman-only issue. One that is confined to the realm of the NGOs. And this is where Tal'at enters, and it is to force a wider emancipatory politics on our agenda as people struggling for liberation. Because for years we have witnessed how the political movements have disregarded our pain and anger. And it's a reality that has left us alienated from politics, also hopeless and without spaces that share our visions. And I think Tal'at, and I'm gonna talk later on about the movement itself, but I think Tal'at was the beginning of some kind of hope that is fueled by anger towards systems of oppression that have weakened us, but also frustration from political movements in Palestine that have further marginalized us as well. And I'm gonna start and say that if we are seeking justice, then our movements need to be just. And no justice can be fulfilled if we don't live and experience justice. And what we in Tal'at came to say is that our struggle for liberation as Palestinians from colonialism holds in its core wider and holistic values of justice and freedom. And this is what feminism is to us, a lens by which we imagine the world to be just and equitable to everyone. And this is not only in Palestine. I think Tal'at is part of wider processes of feminist mobilization and revolutionary traditions, because feminists worldwide are articulating feminism that sees oppression as structurally rooted in capitalism and intersecting with race, sexuality, and colonialism. And that those systems shape our social relations as well. And what this means is that we in Tal'at, our feminism goes beyond the individual gender-based demands, but rather we challenge the wider systems that create violence. And this feminist lens is what makes us look at the margins of society, at women, at the working class, at those exploited, and all who have endured the savagery of the systems that control us. We centralize our voices as women who live in a special position and positionality within society as a weakened and a marginalized group in society. And from this stance, we analyze social and political dynamics. And I think this has never been more apparent than the current moment that we are all living. I think COVID-19 pandemic has made it clear what a health crisis and lockdown measures mean for different groups of people, what it means for women who are trapped in violent homes with no ability to escape. What does it mean for laborers who lost their income? What does it mean for refugees who are left with no protection? What does it mean for people who face forced displacement? What does it mean for people who are incarcerated or living under siege? And that we as feminists choose to shed light on these issues and choose to step out, not only for demanding justice to women, but also to demonstrate for our martyrs who are being murdered on the streets of Jerusalem, for example, is not a coincidence. The fact that women are organizing and marching the streets for these issues, first of all, is a milestone in Palestine. And also being women organizing and at the forefront of these struggles is feminist. I think also the current moment has also shown us very clearly what solidarity means and why it's necessary. What it means also to look at our neighbor that is being beaten up by a family member, or to ask about those who have no income. But I would also like to talk about solidarity here and how we perceive it in Tal'at. And since we began, we have talked a lot about feminist solidarity. And in the Palestinian context, this has many meanings. What Tal'at actively does is push against the tide of geographical, political, and social fragmentation that is engulfing the Palestinian landscape. And that is why when we first organized, we were seeking to go down to the streets, women from the different geographies of Palestine, both in historic Palestine and the diaspora. And we're a shattered community, we're a shattered society. Colonialism has stripped us of symbolic and material resources and has actively reinforced patriarchal structures in society. And this is a reality that cannot be changed without a radical collective process of healing, which informs our liberation struggle. And here is where solidarity enters. And I think we also live in a reality of political fragmentation. For in one part, the Oslo Accords have accelerated a process of statehood, which in itself fed into the 48 political movements centering around citizenship under the Israeli state, and adding to that the total disregard of the refugees of Gaza and Jerusalem. And we are not able to fight as a unified front against colonialism, but we are also unable to imagine the Palestine that we want. And here where Tal'at also enters, asking the question, what kind of homeland do we imagine? And what we say is that we imagine Palestine to be a free, safe, and just homeland and place to all of its members. And for that to happen in the future, we need to bring politics back to the people and relate to people's social experiences within society. Now, I have been talking about the wider politics and messages of Tal'at, but I would also like to talk about the movement itself. Our official starting point was a year ago on September 26th, where we marched the streets in 12 different localities in Palestine and the diaspora under the banner, "There is no free homeland without free women." Of course, this moment came after a long process of organizing. It is one of the rare times that women decide to take to the streets under an explicit political and feminist banner. The catalyst for this was the increase in femicide cases in all of Palestine. and the murder of Isra Ghraib, who was brutally beaten up by relatives. But similar to other cases, her murder was met with social legitimization or silence. But not only that, Isra Ghraib's story demonstrates really well how the different institutions are complicit. For Isra was shouting in the hospital with no one coming to her rescue. And this is exactly what we in Tal'at are saying, that the daily violence that we live is part of wider structures of oppression that feed into that violence. And this is manifested in a lot of ways that I'm just gonna mention a few. Either shutting down cases of domestic violence, or keeping stories under the rug, or regarded as suicide, or dealing with cases through the traditional tribal structures within society that don't do justice to women. And family institutions is also as well complicit at times. In many cases happen within the family by brother or father or cousin. And we also know that the stories that we know do not include many women who have been victims of domestic violence, nor those who face all kinds of sexual, physical, emotional, and economic violence on a daily basis. But this was our way of, first of all, taking these issues from the realm of the private to the public and creating a social and political discourse. But again, not only as a woman's issue, but as an issue that relates to our society as a society, and the type of society that we want to live in Palestine. We need to see power dynamics within our society. We need to see those that are in the margins. We need those people to be part of the politics and the political movements. And that was, I think, Tal'at came in a way to fill this gap that we saw during the years within the Palestinian political movements. At the moment, we have different groups of Tal'at in Haifa, Yafa, Ramallah, and Jerusalem, and of course with the hopes of expanding. But our activism is not only local, and the locality was a political and strategic decision based on our knowledge that the fragmentation has fragmented our realities in the different geographies. But we don't stop there. Our politics is that of defragmentation and creating a unified feminist voice that looks at all of Palestine and talks about Palestine as a whole. But this process, and that's what we say in Tal'at, must include in its core a social process, and not only a political one, in the sense that it's only liberating ourselves from Zionism, but again having the ability to talk about our issues within society, and from there building a vision of the type of Palestine that we want to see here. And without a doubt, I think bringing Palestinian women together under one umbrella in a decentralized and defragmented space of feminist, political, grassroots, independent activism is not a simple task. But it's just a start towards building a long social and collective process of change. And marching the streets back then was one tool. And we know that not everyone has the ability to go to the streets. And we also know that change is a long and cumulative process that requires us to think of our tools and strategies to serve the purpose of the struggle and resistance under an anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, and anti-patriarchal framework. I'm gonna stop here in the hopes of having a discussion later on with people. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much. And I already see how, all of these portions are really building on one another. So with that, I'm really excited to turn to Eyes.
Thank you. And first, I'd like to thank Omar and Eyewitness Palestine for hosting what I feel is one of the most vital conversations we should be having right now as Palestinians and as people who are committed to the liberation of Palestine and the liberation of the world we live in. And thank you, Ferouz and Hala. Just a note, these two women are people that I learned from and have been really learning from in the past couple of years and beyond. And so I feel really honored to be able to share this space with them and be a part of this discussion, because I think from what you might hear is that there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of frustration in young Palestinians who live under the boot of occupation back home in our homeland. And also, it's a frustration that I feel like a lot of people feel it, but there hasn't been spaces or ways to articulate what's happening, because we're so revolved in the cycle of running through the motions. And like Ferouz described, we've created the history of disappointing leadership and allies has created a cycle that keeps revolving, that is centered around this humanitarian lens. And we feel stuck. And when we shifted to look at Palestine through a humanitarian lens, we have created limitations for ourselves. We've created limitations for how we speak about our experience and we only speak about it through the lens of how can I get funding for talking about the experience of Palestinians. And we often feel in our work and particularly through the nonprofits realm that we're constantly trying to figure out how do we convince the world of our suffering? How do we convince the world to look at us as humans? How do we and in that way, what happens in that we forget ourselves. We forget how to speak to each other, Palestinian to Palestinian. The walls between us grow wider and wider, and fragmentation, as Hala really described, is the fragmentation has been a cancer within the landscape of Palestinian society. And we no longer have an ability to debate and discuss amongst ourselves without there being this voyeuristic tendency from NGOs and from also the Zionists. Everyone's looking at us, right? While we're trying to struggle for liberation, and it takes a toll. And all of this is by colonial design, because the pain and the anguish we experience as an oppressed people literally changes how we think and how we are able to cope and how we're able to process things. And what ends up happening is that this process is burning us out. It's burning us out, this inundation of just trying to be perfect for the world and perfect for, being the perfect victim has created us to burn out and lose relationship with each other. And what happens is, for many, and I see this for myself and for many of my friends and young Palestinians, from the United States all the way to Palestine, is that we end up falling into cynicism because we're so exhausted. Cynicism creates that fragmentation. We already assume, that we're not gonna be politically aligned with someone before we even have a discussion. So we don't even try to have a conversation. And this perpetuates itself over and over and over again. And then social media amplifies it. And then it becomes this echo chamber where people are, we're posting the same photos, having the same conversations, and the nuance gets lost and the relationships get lost. And what's been happening and what happens is that we focus so much on the outside. We focus so much on the physical barriers that keep us physically distant, right? And we try to comprehend these structures that physically oppress us, and we try to understand them, and then we work to try and dismantle them. We make, we go outside, and which, is a very important element, to go outside and be able to be like, I recognize your struggle because these systems are very similar to how we are also living under this boot of oppression. When we go to indigenous communities and Black communities and we build, right? But what also happens, and this is something that alQaws and the framework of alQaws really tries to put, we also need to start looking on the inside, right? As the structures and systems that are created by humans and patriarchy, and we forget that inside we also have these oppressive colonial structures that we need to dismantle within ourselves. And when these colonial structures within ourselves start building and we keep on ignoring it, it's a cancer that takes over our hearts and our compassion, and we completely get lost. And from my perspective, I'm seeing this happen more and more within our people. We are tired. We're losing hope. We're fighting more with each other, and in a way that isn't through productive debate or productive ways of moving forward, but we're our communities, and we've seen this historically through any colonized community, right? And the thing is, Palestine, in terms of the world, in a really weird, bittersweet way, Palestine has been able to sustain supports, global supports by people. And we've been able to sustain movements and conversation, and people know what Palestine is. There are colonized communities in this world who are literally, as we speak, being wiped off the maps because they don't have the resources or the tools, or what I'm seeing right now is our willpower as Palestinians is diminishing. And because of what Feiruz was speaking about how we're looking, like we're helping colonization perpetuate itself in this meta kind of way in which it's killing our being. And let me so that was kind of like that was passionate, I realize, but I also think that as from the framework of alQaws is a Palestinian organization that focuses and advocates for sexual and gender diversity within Palestinian society. So this organization is made up of a lot of young Palestinian, and also not just young, but intergenerational Palestinian queer and trans advocates and activists. We understand that these systems, and we believe that experience as queer and trans people, for myself as a trans man, I went through a long process and still am going through a long process of really digging in deep of the structures that that have prevented me being my full self for so long. And for a lot of us, we understand these systems in a deeper way, because from our lens, we see how the fake hierarchies and the political of the colonizer gets reproduced and recycled amongst each other in our society, and even amongst each other in our communities. And so we oftentimes have to step back and reflect and reassess and figure out, wait, what are we doing wrong here? And of course, it's not a perfect system. alQaws has been around for 20 years, and most recently, it's really expanded amongst Palestinian queers because of we've been able to break down geographies and break down really push a discourse and create space for young people to heal and to grow and to cultivate knowledge and be able to express themselves and go through the process without feeling like their whole worlds are come crashing down because they're queer. And because they're queer and Palestinian, the world tells them that they have to choose. But what we say is, no, you don't choose, because what we're fighting for is a world, a society where we don't reserve rights for certain different types of communities. We don't say, we don't want to live in a world where we say, oh, well, you're queer, so we're gonna have to like figure out how to, you know, give you some rights, but not the full rights as a Palestinian man would have, or as a colonizer would have, right? And I think that for us, for years, historically, through any queer movements, this is the central demand. We want to break down these systems that create these political hierarchies and really think about liberation through a lens where, as Hala mentioned, like where we can all be free. How can we be very expansive in our thought of liberation, where the most marginal person in society, we need to fight for the most marginal society, because until they get freedom and they get the rights to be able to live freely and safely, we all can't be free, right? And let me slow down. And I think that alQaws, we, you know, particularly, I think there's this conversation, and I know that members of Talat also are part of this, and Ferouz, and this is like the discourse that is, I hope, like really gaining steam, and I'm hoping that it also comes to the US movement as well. Like we have to look at ourselves and do the internal work and understanding that like this is an inside out approach, right? Like we have to find ways to create spaces to heal in a, you know, I think that capitalism has really taken this word healing and diminished the root of what it is, right? It's to process, it's to go through breakthroughs, it's to really feel rooted and grounded in yourself. And capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, all of these systems were designed to keep us distracted from ourselves. So the resistance that we see is being able to create and cultivate these spaces where we're able to build these relationships and these trusting ways of organizing for our liberation. Yeah, like how can we break out of these echo chambers and use our creativity and use our drive? Like we are a very, humans are very exceptional in a lot of ways, right? Our minds are so expansive. And so it's, you know, how do we cut through the noise and how are we able to really see each other? Because the way that things are going, we are seeing each other less and less and less. And that is, and like I mentioned, that is by design colonialism. And so we have to get at the root. We have to start looking internal, like dismantling the structures inside of us as well. And so I'm gonna end this because I feel like I spoke a lot, but the alQaws praxis, you know, I feel very fortunate because to be a part of alQaws, because I feel like alQaws and the political framework that alQaws has been building for years and years and is still trying to build and figure out and navigate, is that we're realizing, oh, just like Talat, you know, like we need to expand the geographic borders, right? We need to break out of these different colonial restrictions, whether it be walls or whether it be, you know, the borders that are created that create different realities for Palestinians. Because even as Palestinian, I grew up in the United States. Like my experience and the way and the lens that I have is different than my comrades in Palestine. And how can we be able to understand each other and see each other through that? So we have, you know, we're really excited to announce that we've been doing a fellowship for 2 years now, where we work with where alQaws activists in Palestine work with young Palestinian queer activists in the US to really build out this collective, you know, network or collective way of organizing with each other. And we're going to be we're going to be expanding the fellowship into next year as well. So if you're a young queer Palestinian, like I really recommend that you get more information and apply, because this is a way that we can really build, you know, we can really resist, right? And we can really start getting that flame going once again, right? And I also think, yeah, I also want to just end by saying that what we're trying to do at alQaws is opening up possibilities for our community to live in Palestine, because Palestine is very, we are a part of the fabric of society of Palestine. And we want to be able to live in a space where we can thrive, just like our, our straight cis counterparts. We want to thrive. We want to live in a place where we can feel safe anywhere, right? And we're committed to staying in Palestine and creating this world and creating this vision. And despite, we can do this, and I truly believe that it, as a movement in general, or as people who are dedicating our time and our labor and our, for the people who are dedicating our time and labor to the cause of Palestinian liberation, we need to hit brakes just a little bit and reevaluate, reassess, and really understand the frustration that Feiruz and Hala and activists at alQaws and a lot of young Palestinians and Palestinians back home are saying. We need a different way. We need to create new political norms. We need to create new ways of liberating ourselves. And it really starts by looking from the inside out. And so I'm gonna end there. Thank you for your time. And I know that hopefully there might be some time for questions. Thank you.
Okay, wow. Thank you, everybody. I think those were all really impressive talks that built on each other and complemented each other really well. I mean, I think particularly, the emphasis on thinking through things in more of a systemic way or a structural way and not necessarily isolating issues. So I think those are definitely some themes that are definitely going to come out in the Q&A. So I just want to flag, we definitely have a lot of questions. We won't be able to get to all of them. But, we see this really as kind of the beginning of an extended series of conversations, right? So this is really in many ways the blueprint for future events and future conversations that we're going to continue to have. So today is really just the beginning. So if your question doesn't get answered, definitely stay tuned for more to come, and definitely, reach out to the organizations, because we put all of the contact info in the chat, so you should be able to access that easily. So with that said, we'll just jump right into it. We had one question, that was asking about the possibility of a one-state solution. And I think, since we're having such a critical conversation right now, I wonder if we can kind of reframe that a little bit to get each of your opinions on, what you think of this idea of state solutions in general, right? Do you think that there's a way of talking about state solutions or framing state solutions that maybe doesn't account for the problems that you're trying to highlight for all of us, right? In terms of the structural issues that really inhibit the realization of true freedom, right? So do you think that when it comes to state solutions, maybe it's about reframing the whole structure of the question? Are there things that we're not considering? Or do you think that, we should think in line of like one state versus two state?
I can start. I love this question. It always comes to people from outside. I never hear this question in Arabic. I actually hear it much more in English, which says a lot about it. So I am not going to answer the question. I am going to answer around the question. In our history, we are used also to solutions being imposed on us, not even proposed. Again, the two-state solution, which I hope everyone listening and watching us tonight or this morning again realizes is dead, long dead, and never gonna happen. But I think that it's interesting to see how this solution was imposed on us. It was imposed by donors on the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. The PLO was on the verge of bankruptcy in the beginning of the 1990s, and donors were like, okay, you want your funds renewed, you have to sit down for peace talks with the Israelis, and there you go, international community and donors forced agendas on the funded Palestinian PLO. The story continues with the Palestinian Authority today. And so I think that what we are, and I will allow myself to say we three are saying here, is that we would like to build and empower our own community. We want to do self-empowerment and community organization and healing, as Iz was saying, in ways that allow us to actually have this conversation ourselves, to have this discussion about solutions ourselves. Right now we are colonized and occupied and busy surviving and chasing our daily bread, and we keep receiving suggestions and ideas about what is the best solution for Palestine. There is a range, a variety of Palestinian opinions. Many Palestinians have different ideas about what the solution can look like, but I would rather focus my answer on the process of reaching and arriving at this answer about a solution, a process that is certainly part of the same struggle and the same movement of liberation that we were all speaking about today. So again, I would rather not go into the details of what type of state solution is suitable for Palestine, as much as focus on the fact that Palestinians themselves are the ones to answer this question. They are the ones to speak their minds about it. And in order to do that, again, we have a lot of healing and emancipation to work on.
Thank you so much. If the other panelists don't have anything to add, I can go ahead and go to the next question.
I think Fayrouz articulated it pretty well. I think we can move on.
Okay, well, I just wanted to check. So next, I'm going to go ahead and combine two questions because they seem related. So the first part is asking for a bit more conversation about organizations that don't compromise their principles or ideologies, right? To speak a bit more about the impacts of that. And then there's another question that I think is related, which is asking for advice on people who volunteer or work with or help fund Palestinian, I believe, civil society organizations and church organizations. So those who are interested in actually supporting helpful CSOs and what they can and should keep in mind doing that.
Okay, I think I'll go again. So first of all, regarding organizations that refuse to compromise on their principles and ideology, well, speaking of funding and the need and dependency on funding for survival as an organization, this usually means that if you refuse to compromise, then you will have very much lower chances of being funded. You have to be very flexible in order to survive as an organization, flexible as in bending your own principles and ideology. And this, of course, this effect is added to the fact that refusing to give up on your ideology and principle and refusing on depoliticization and insisting on remaining political as an organization, of course, bring upon other risks by the occupation authorities, because then, I mean, even when you are not political as a Palestinian organization, for example, especially in Jerusalem, then you are always at the risk of being prosecuted and oppressed by the Israeli occupation authorities that use all sorts of excuses to shut down organizations, to shut down events, and so on and so forth. So this is the dilemma that organizations find themselves facing all the time. Do I stick to my principle and ideology and give up on the chances to survive or not? And this is exactly the vicious circle that we need to break free out of. And I have to add that I cannot not think about the irony in the fact that one huge part of the donor fields or funding fields is capacity building when it comes to democracy and human rights, state building, as if it's possible to build a state under occupation. And it is interesting to notice, and this will connect to the other half of the question. It's interesting to notice that the countries that are preaching here to us about democracy and human rights are not doing very well themselves about it back home. I have to say that it is provocative, it is repulsive as a Palestinian to again be lectured about democracy and you savages, you need to learn about human rights and you need to learn about democracy and democratic principles, while we see that human rights are not doing very well, nor in North America, nor in Europe, the biggest donors to Palestine. Human rights are not doing very well there. Freedom of expression is not doing very well there. Fascism, racism, white supremacy, everywhere we turn our heads, we see how the situation there is grave. And this will connect me to the question about volunteering, because I think that in the state of mind of people, and again, even unawarely, when people think about Palestine and what can be done in Palestine or to help Palestine, then people sitting in the United States or in some Western European country think that it is helpful, or maybe it is the only option, to either send money or to come here and volunteer, help us in our olive harvest, or help us walk children to schools because settlers attack them on the way, or help us in building or rebuilding and many other types of volunteer work that is done here. And again, it is nice of you to come and volunteer in Palestine, but I think that people here are failing to see that the bigger importance and the bigger effect would be if people create political change back home. People think that it's only the $3.8 billion check that the United States government sent to Israel is allowing the occupation to go on, and they do not understand that the situation of human rights again and democracy in the United States is directly affecting my political reality as a Palestinian. It's not only directly to help Palestine, but also people need to understand that as long as people of color in the US are facing oppressive systems and white supremacy and racism, systematic and ongoing, then of course this means that foreign policy on countries like Palestine and other areas around the world will be just the same, right-wing, racist, white supremacist. And so I think that people need to realize that it is important for us to receive the help of olive harvest support and volunteering in our communities here. That is true. But we think that there is a much higher importance in changing political realities. This only shows how struggles around the world are also connected. The struggle of indigenous people and people of color in the United States should be connected to the struggle of Palestinians for liberation and to other struggles around the world, because eventually it is important to understand we are all facing one global system of imperialism and capitalism that is supporting, systems are supporting each other in different areas. And it is important that people in the West and in the global North understand that they're not doing so well. And once they start fixing their own homes, that would be the biggest help to Palestine.
And I'd like to piggyback off that, if that's cool.
Yeah,
I mean,
please.
What Feiruz is saying, like, it goes back to it's the inside out framework. And it applies, as I speak about it for Palestinians, it literally applies to every single human being. We, I can speak from the perspective as I sit in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Literally, I just saw a truck with a huge Trump flag drive by. And it makes me think that we have, as people who live within this Western, also very colonial states, right? We have a lot of healing to do as well, right? And and exactly what Feiruz said, we need to go and look at ourselves. We have to look at ourselves first before we go and try to impose an idea that the way that we live in Western countries is the standard. It's the example model. That as we see, and as we see as this empire is crumbling, that is not the case. And I think that we need to create new systems, new ways of thinking how we can collectivize our struggle. Because you know, it's really, to me, something that's very, very disturbing and horrifying that I witness is that here we are on indigenous land as settlers in the United States, and we talk, like, I'm in a lot of circles where, you know, activist circles where they'll say, oh, what can we do to help Palestine? What, like, always thinking strategically of how to help Palestinians there. While currently, the only thing that we do to mention indigenous people is land acknowledgements. People are literally, they're living under this boot of colonialism in their reservations, in their pueblos, in their communities. And here we are as settlers wondering how we can fight the settlers in Israel, and they are of the same mind. We have to have this understanding that these systems will fall and these structures will be dismantled once we're able to realize that these structures are around us all. Patriarchy, colonialism, white supremacy, it's inherent. It's a structure that's literally covered the whole world. So how in our geographic position can we go up and just try and tear them down? Anyway, so yeah, that's what I have to say.
Thank you. So we had a question actually that was for Hala specifically. There was some interest in the concept that you were describing in your talk of reimagining Palestine. But the question is, you know, what does it mean exactly to reimagine Palestine? And, you know, I think it's good maybe to make this explicit. And if anybody else wants to jump in, definitely feel free. But when we say reimagining Palestine, right, is that referring to, you know, the occupied territories, right, inside 48 or both? And does that also somehow include, you know, Palestinians who are, you know, experiencing refugeehood or exiled, you know, because of the ongoing colonial project?
Thank you. I'm talking about all of Palestine, which means I'm talking about historic Palestine, but I'm also talking about the diaspora. And I think one of the things that I was saying, that we have lived a reality of fragmentation due to colonialism, due to the Zionist project on our land. We're fragmented geographically, and we're also fragmented politically, and political elites have enhanced this fragmentation throughout the year through different political discourses. For me, when I say reimagine Palestine, I reimagine all of Palestine. And for me, when I say Palestine, I mean relating to all of the parts of Palestine that are here in historic Palestine, 48, West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem. But I want to stress that, again, I'm also talking about the diaspora. And I think for me, this is a political decision, and it's a feminist one as well, because when I say that I want Palestine to be free and I want Palestine to be just, I need to understand that Palestine is fragmented. I need to understand what people outside of Palestine, Palestinians, live on a daily basis, what they endure in the place. That's what I've been saying, that throughout the years we have been living through a vacuum in our political because no political warming this need of ours to think in a unified way of how we want to fight the Zionist project on our land, and also to imagine Palestine. And when I say imagine Palestine, I say imagine it, and I think one of the things in Talat is the aspect of imagining and reimagining, and I think this is what we bring new to the table, is the concept that we're not only fighting for liberating our lands, but we're also fighting for a certain type of society and homeland that we want to live in, that is free from colonialism, all all throughout Palestine, with the return of the refugees, but also one that is safe to all of its members, that is just to all of its members. I hope that this is clearer now.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that was a great clarification. And I think it also helps set us up for another question that actually specifically came for Hala and Izzuddin. But of course, you know, if all of you want to jump on, feel free. But basically, it was a question on the idea of, you know, initiatives that really uplift and support, you know, Palestinians because of and not in spite of, you know, difference or diversity. And it seems like right now, you know, there's such an emphasis on fighting the fragmentation, you know, that plays out in different forms, you know, whether it's whether it's gendered, whether it's colonial, whether it's economic, or all of them actually influencing one another, right? Which I think really you hit on in terms of your emphasis on the intersections. I guess the question being then, can you talk a bit more about, you know, initiatives that you've either seen or participated in that continue to further this project of fighting fragmentation? Do you think that, have you seen anything in addition to the work that all of you are doing that you think bodes positively? And what would you say still remains to be done, you know, that people can look forward to?
Hala, do you want to go first?
No, you can go first. I can go after you.
Okay, well, I think that there are initiatives that are taking place, particularly within small collectives of people, and I know that within particularly the queer sphere, it's like there's fragmentation within fragmentation. But one thing that I'll speak about alQaws, because I actually do believe, Yani, that again, nobody's perfect. Nobody's, you know, has achieved the perfect formula. But the praxis of being able to go into communities where, you know, of course, there's going to be some hostility because of these structures of patriarchy that were created that view, you know, queer and trans people as, yani, degenerate, or like, you know, like, as part of not the fabric of society, right? They try to rip us from the fabric of society. And so go into these communities, have the praxis of, we want to separate ourselves from the rest of the Palestinian society, just because right now there isn't this point of understanding where there is healing, and this trauma and this colonial thought has really made it hard for people to sit and reflect and have conversations. And we try to push, right? We go, alQaws creates intentional spaces for young people who are even questioning, right? We go into spaces where we work with schools, we work with counselors, therapists, really try to educate them or provide toolkits of how we can talk about issues of sexual diversity and gender in the context of also colonialism that we live under. And I also think that it's really important that when we think about how we create spaces of like, I feel like I kind of missed my point because I'm a little rant, but I think that ultimately it comes from like historically queers have all had to create these spaces, because what happens is when we decide to divide ourselves, fragment ourselves from society, we fragment ourselves from each other, and then we replicate, you know, forms of oppression. But like the deep understanding is that no, we're all part of this society and we're all a part of these systems. And so we need to find ways to really create and cultivate spaces for that, for healing and growth and for conversations. And it's going to take a really it's hard to confront hard truths. It's the hardest thing. And I feel like as humans, we try so hard to turn away from it and avoid it and not have to get over this hump of going in deep with ourselves. But it's crucial. And I think that for alQaws and a lot of queer organizations, we've come to this realization of oh, we have to do this work in order to get over it, and then really push for the pathway we want to go on collectively as Palestinian humans. Yeah. All right. Hannah.
I think if I understood the question correctly, I think one of the things is that it's not only a question of what kinds of initiatives are there that include diversity, but I think it's also how we relate to this issue and how we talk about it, and how it's manifested in our social relations, and the ways in which we decide to deal with these questions as political questions. And I think in order for us to do so, and go beyond the fact that our movement include this and this and that, I think we need to understand what this really means. And in order for us to do so, I think we should think about our purpose. And one of the things, and I'm gonna go back to Talat, and I think one of the things that we try to do is actually build a political movement that is aware of the fact that we need to be also strategic in the way we deal with these aspects within movements, but also building a long process of change. And there are a lot of initiatives in Palestine. But again, the question is, what is our purpose at the end of the day? Because what we want to see is something cumulative, something continued, something ongoing, something that can relate to social and political dynamics, also within our movements, and then talk about society. And when we talk about being a political movement, that is exactly what we mean. I'm not sure I understood the question correctly, so I'm just winging it, but I hope it was helpful.
No, yeah, you're great. I mean, the question was basically, what work do you see that's being done to continue to fight fragmentation, and what needs to continue to be done? So, I mean, I think that perfectly encapsulates it. So I think this is a good question, in light of the recent developments over the past few years. But, since a lot of you are talking about the problematic nature of, sometimes the way that things can be framed within a humanitarian context, at the same time, understanding how, right, the humanitarian approach and angle has come to represent such an infrastructure, right, within the framing of addressing Palestine, right? What are your thoughts on the question of, lobbying or agitating for the reinstatement of UNRWA funding? Because obviously, the cutting of that raised a lot of these issues, right? To what extent do we continue to fight for reinstatement? To what extent do we challenge this idea of the sort of humanitarian exceptionalization of Palestine? So I guess, what are your thoughts on that issue? I think that'll be a good question to end with before getting your final remarks.
I think that this is a very good question. And the UNRWA is the United Nations Work and Relief Agency that was created in 1948 with the so-called the problem of the Palestinian refugees, and its purpose was to act for a limited amount of time on helping these refugees who had just lost their lands and homes, have been expelled, many and most of them outside of Palestine, not only outside of their own villages that were destroyed. And the idea was that this is a short-term idea for relief until the problem is solved. And it's important to say that it's not only UNRWA. Now all aid is UNRWA, or aid is UNRWA, and UNRWA is aid, and it's all humanitarian, and it's all problematic, and it all should be temporary, but it's all permanent and very destructive. It's not only not helping, but it is destroying, and it is disempowering. Now, having said this, I need to, I'm going to split the rest of my answer to 2 points. The first one is the fact that advocacy or lobbying in the United States for the continuation by United States citizens, for the continuity of the funding or the reinstatement of the funding to UNRWA it could be a good step, but it has to be a step as part of a longer process, a bigger strategic process. I don't think that there is strategy when it comes to aid. You know, we are aware of the need, the crucial need for us strategizing, looking to the future, building and organizing. I think there is no strategic planning when it comes to aid. It's like capitalists want to look good, so they just send money to Palestine, and then whatever happens, happens. At the same time, I think the question should take us to the bigger question of what do we do when there is a dilemma? Because we understand that humanitarian aid is there because there is a need for it. So I am not saying that refugees or displaced families, newly created refugees who get their homes demolished, for example, they need alternative shelter. I cannot claim that this need does not exist. But this keeps us at the micro level, where you're like, oh, so are you, Fairuz, saying that people should not have food or money for education or schools? No, this is not what I am saying. What I'm saying is we need to build a strategy to help us break free of this need for this type of aid. And on the macro level, we should see how problematic it is, because it furthers dependency and Palestinian passiveness. But again, I think that on our side as Palestinians, what we need to do is revive existing models of mutual aid that we have in our history, in our society, in our culture, in a way that organizations support each other, movements support each other, communities support each other, in a way that this urgent need is answered by the community itself, in a way that makes us strong enough and confident enough to say, you know what? No, thank you. We don't need your very problematic aid. So this dilemma, we need to pass beyond it by creating our own and reviving. Again, it's not even creating something new, but reviving what international aid itself has destroyed in our community. I mean, the whole notion of individualism is a direct result of international aid systems and capitalist systems. So we need to build the structures that would take away this powerful grip that aid has over our communities, even when it comes to the very basic humanitarian aid needs.
Can I just add one small thing?
Please.
I think, and I'm gonna continue Fairuz's point from here. I think what the UNRWA case actually revealed is the need for us as society and activists also to understand the materialist realities of the different Palestinian groups, which is something, unfortunately, we don't do enough. And we don't relate to class politics within our societies. And I think one of the things that the whole UNRWA issue raised is the fact that we suddenly understood that there are people who are in need. And yeah, like Fairuz said, there are no alternatives. Like, there are no alternatives. And this is part of the reality. This is part of a political reality that we are living, that there is no alternative. So what I wanna invite people to do, and again, it's not done enough, is to think what we as a society can do. And I think starting from understanding the need, the economic and social needs, and to understand the positionality of people, and to understand their materialist realities, and take that, and I'm gonna relate to what I said earlier, and take that into consideration when we think about political mobilization, when we think about political movement, when we think about political activism. We cannot disregard these realities, and we cannot afford to not take into consideration the lived experiences of the different social groups. Yeah, thank you.
And I'll just add by saying that they both brilliantly diagnosed the problem and also gave, a solution. And to add on to the solution is we need to have more of these conversations. Talat's doing a really amazing job. Activists and grassroots alQaws doing an amazing job else, right? And really creating spaces of, alQaws is going through right now in academic school where these conversations are, happening. And we need to expand these conversations. And I think that, Yani, like it needs to be conversations starting, like having it in little communities and expanding out, being able to do that cross connection between Palestinians who are doing organizing here in Turtle Island and working, being in communication with organizers in Palestine and having these real in-depth conversations about what are the material means that we're dealing with here in terms of economic and social and political ramifications within our society and within our families and within our spaces. Like how can we start inside out build these structures? And I want to also just really re-emphasize what Hala said is we really need to interrogate the question of the class dynamics that are playing out and how the political elite, like the thing is this, I am a firm believer that we need to find mechanisms to be able to have these real truth conversations with each other. And instead of creating these walls we need to actually sit and be like, listen, what you're doing, the reproducing oppressive structures are weighing us down. You might reap the benefits of it, but ultimately those benefits that you are reaping from it are going to go away just like the rest of us, because at the end of the day, we're colonized people. We're colonized people. It doesn't matter if you're a millionaire or living in a mkhayam, in a refugee camp. We're all colonized people, and at the end of the day, morality and finding ways of being able to get past this this obstacle that's just been in our face for the past 70 years. We need to collectivize and really think of approaches and structures we can create and revitalize the spirit of the Palestinian people, because it's there. It's dim, but it's there, and we need to revitalize our willpower to get liberation. And Yani, anyway, so thank you everyone for listening, and Cruz and Hala. I learned so much just sitting here and listening as well.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I definitely agree with that sentiment. I also learned a lot just from hearing from each of you. So on that note, I think we should probably wrap up, but I'd like to extend the floor if any of you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share that maybe weren't answered or brought up in the Q&A.
No.
Follow the Facebook pages, even though social media is evil, but follow Facebook pages of alQaws, Grassroots alQaws, and Talat. because you'll learn a lot. And thankfully, even though translation is horrible, yani, there is Google Translate. You can see we're writing in Arabic, and I think that it's a great way to like be connected to the work that we're doing.
Thank you so much. So definitely stay tuned, because this is only the beginning and we're looking into having a part 2 of these conversations. Definitely, as Azadeen is saying, be sure to check out all of the links for the organizations. And finally, also be sure to follow Eyewitness Palestine's virtual delegations. And this October, we're going to start off the olive harvest season by visiting the Palestine Alien Seed Library. So definitely be sure to check that out as well. Thank you again to all of the panelists. Thank you for everybody who came in to watch. And thank you also to Emily of Eyewitness Palestine, who was helping a lot behind the scenes.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, you too. Bye-bye.